Well, here we go. Thank you very much for coming today. Bore da, mae'n neis I gweld chi gyd. Thank you for joining us here at the St David's Hotel in Cardiff Bay, just opposite the Senedd. And we're here today because Cavendish has asked YouGov to take the temperature of voters in Wales ahead of what is going to be a fascinating year in politics. We're particularly looking today at energy policy because we know it's a huge debate. Lots of very valid views all over the range of debates that we've had in Wales, and it's going to get even hotter, we think. So what we've done today, we've got a report showing some of the highlights of the YouGov polling that we're releasing. You'll be able to see all the numbers, but we've just got some of the highlights here on the stage. What I'm going to be talking through is some of the highlights and then asking our panel to comment. So thank you ever so much for coming this morning. We've got Jess from RenewableUK, Richard from RenewableUK, and we've got Aled from NISO. And then at the end, we'll take some questions as well. So if you don't mind, we'll come around with a mic for some questions. We're filming today as well, so we'll be releasing this later, and you can go back and watch it. You'll be able to download the report as well as the data behind it. So what we've done in terms of the questions that we've asked is not just around what people think about energy, what people think about renewable energy, what people think about the types of transmission infrastructure that we might need. We've also asked them about what they think about climate change and what they think about net zero. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. So let's have a start. If you think about what the Welsh Government and other governments around the UK are dealing with, it's a little bit of a mismatch with the energy that we need and where the energy is and where people live and work. So a really complex policy issue around delivering the future energy needs of Wales. And we were trying to see whether the debate itself is reflecting what people actually think. So I'm going to talk about some of the highlights today. We've got some suggestions around the voters for certain parties and what they think about renewable energy. Now, I'm going to explain that the numbers that we're using here is around voting intention. So we've got lots of data in the YouGov polling that we'll be releasing, which will be based on how people voted in the last election. But that's a while ago now, and boy, has politics changed in the last year. So there's also some data in there about voter intention. So what you'll see in this presentation is around voter intention for the Senedd next year. And what you can see, some of the headlines here, is that there really is quite a significant level of support for renewable energy, which has got to be positive for people who are concerned about climate change. What we've seen is very high numbers, sort of 7 in 10 of voters in Wales would like to see more renewable energy. And that's across the piece, whatever party people were intending to vote for. So you've got very high numbers in the sort of progressive parties, one could argue. So let's have a look at that. 92% of people intending to vote Plaid Cymru supportive of more solar energy in their local area. And even half of those who intend to vote Reform are keen to see more renewable energy. We'll give you some more detail on that. But I'm going to ask Richard, do you think that's a surprise? Is that something that you would expect to see?
Well, it's not what you see in the press, is it? It's not. I mean, the most frustrating thing for us at the moment is that the sort of the political consensus for tackling climate change and investing in renewables seems to have been lost. It's been lost to some quite polarising positions across the parties, and it's really, really destructive for us. So I'm just very, very encouraged to see this, actually, is that the bulk of the middle ground still believes that's the right thing to do. But unless it translates into actual policy, then we're going to very much struggle to invest.
Well, let's have a look at it in more detail. Firstly, we asked people about what they thought about climate change, and we knew that there was a little bit of an issue with how we talked about net zero, so we really wanted to test that. This is about how we communicate with people as well. This is about how we have this conversation. If we have a conversation about net zero, we know that there's a little bit of a challenge in the way that we use that language. So we did actually ask that. Is there a significant difference between how people think about tackling climate change as opposed to reaching net zero targets? And we found there was a bit of a difference, but it wasn't huge. So what you can see here is that 49% of people say that tackling climate change is very important. I thought that was a bit low, actually. But it's 49%, and it's 40% of people who want to reach net zero. So there is a bit of a difference in how we should talk about these things, I think. And I think that's been driven somewhat by the political parties and by the polarisation in some of the debate. Now, Aled, you've got a difficult job in the sense that you have to communicate with people across Wales, across the UK, about some of our future energy needs and what we might need to do to reach energy security, for example. Do you think this might impact on how you communicate with people? Have you seen that in the rooms that you are in?
So I think that there is an interesting part about what the general people, what the general consensus is. That thing about surprising, I think, is what Richard said, which is the surprising thing to me is that this is surprising in the sense that we have seen this longitudinal kind of study, data from people like DESNES, for example, which has seen this very strong support for renewable energy. So I think it's 2022 is 88% of people support renewable energy. So really this number of 8 out of 10 or 7 out of 10 is actually quite soft, considering that, and that might be down to the consensus that we've seen in politics and how that's changed. What we've seen in NESO, so NESO, we're the National Energy System Operator, we're a relatively new organisation and we're independent. We're independent of government, we're independent of the energy industry, and we don't create policy, so we respond to policy. But what's interesting to us in the way that what people are telling us through our own data, but also our own stakeholder engagement, is that when you combine it with cost, when somebody says, how are you delivering this and the cost to you financially, as well as other costs as well, that understanding of cost is there, and especially in Wales, where the number of people who struggle to pay their energy bills is so high. So people are very supportive when you talk about this in the context of finance as well.
Well, we're going to come back to finances, because if you look at the next statistic, that proportion of people who are interested in tackling climate change reduces quite significantly when you say it's going to hit them in the pockets. So in a cost of living crisis, if you say to them, would you like to tackle climate change? It's going to cost you, then that drops to 25%. We also have quite an intransigent group, but it's quite small, of people who are just not interested in climate change, tackling it at all, and who are not interested in net zero. But it is a small number, and if you think about it, that number is quite noisy at the moment and is actually having a bit of an effect on the debate. Let's have a look at this. This is party support, so that's voter intention at the next election around climate change. Now, I apologise to those of my friends in the room that might vote Conservative that we haven't got them on the graph here. There's a reason for that. Conservatives aren't having a great time in Wales at the moment, and when you look at the data, you will be able to see the responses for Conservative members, but we have not been able to use it in our reporting because of the statistical significance. So we've got 1,000 people. We couldn't find, you have to have at least 100 people voting a certain way to be able to effectively use voter intention. So that's why we've focused the graphs here on Labour, Plaid Cymru and Reform. Of course, that is an important context ahead of the Senedd. And what you can clearly see here is the sort of left-leaning voters hugely supportive of tackling climate change, and clearly the Reform voters not. But still, is there a significant difference, would you say, between Labour and Plaid Cymru? Jess, I think we've been at a number of different conferences over the last month. Have you seen a difference amongst members as opposed to the politicians, or are you getting a different level of signalling from each of the parties?
It's a very interesting situation we find ourselves in. And the Labour Party conference, obviously quite UK focused, really big enthusiasm for renewables. It was stark. There were so many side events committed to talking about climate change, talking about renewables and the potential impact and the economic opportunity from it. Conversely, the Plaid conference, there was a very different sort of sentiment and an underlying policy ideology, if you like, that there's a lot to be had potentially from putting forward strong positions that are, as Richard sort of alluded to, quite polarising. These stats are really reassuring, I think, in that regard, and I think Plaid can take from these stats that there is a position that they can take that is more middle ground, is more pragmatic than the positions they are perhaps speaking to at the moment, that will enable them to come forward and retain these voters.
Well, let's move on and have a look at something else that's really fascinating. We did find some statistical differences in terms of age. So it's quite clear that younger people are far more interested in tackling climate change for itself. They want to protect the environment. They want to talk about those issues. But when you get a bit older, you're a lot more worried about the money in your pockets. And what you can see here is that graph is showing you that older people are more worried about the impact on their finances. And maybe that might also affect how we talk to communities about the energy that we need. Aled, what did you think about that one?
Yes, we see similar things. I think what we see as well as part of our stakeholder engagement, so we talk a lot to different bits of society as well. So this idea of that polarised debate. So what is the silent majority saying in the middle? So for example, organisations, so businesses, looking at the cost of energy, but people like older people or people with disabilities, or of course those kind of campaigning on poverty. So those groups in particular really give us that strong message about the need for this to be taken up. And again, I just come back to cost because it is a prevailing theme that we get through the engagement that we have, is the cost and how it impacts on people and needing energy to be right for them and to be available to them. So can you imagine if you were on life-supporting equipment and you need electricity to drive that? Can you imagine what you feel like, when there's a storm, and the ability to be able to have secure energy becomes much more important to you?
Let's see what else we have here. Now, we did ask a question about what types of infrastructure that you would prefer in your local area. It wouldn't be a huge surprise to anybody, I think, that we found that healthcare, housing and transport came first. But I will take you straight on to the next graph, because we did ask about energy here. So this is a question about you had a choice of 3 here, so it's not exactly percentages. So clearly hospitals at the top, but renewable energy, quite a number of people preferred that, and when you talked about different non-renewable energy, a lot less supportive. Let's have a quick look at the next one. This is the one that I think is absolutely fascinating. So this is when we asked about what type of energy infrastructure you would like in your local area. So we asked about Wales generally, and then we asked about your local area. And for me, I was just really quite surprised, given some of the debate on solar that we've seen, with senior politicians and placards outside, large-scale solar. Actually, nearly 80% of people are pretty happy with solar in their local area. The energy from waste one is interesting because we didn't really explain what that means. I don't think most people quite understand exactly what that is, but people don't mind us making energy from waste, which is great. At the bottom here, I know we've got nuclear. I think we are actually expecting an interesting announcement on nuclear this week in Wales, so it'll be interesting to see how this plays out in public. So obviously, we are actually asking about that type of energy in your local area. So would you like to live next to a nuclear power plant is probably the question that people are answering at that point. But I mean, we have got huge levels of support for renewable energy. So Jess, you must, as somebody who works within the industry, think that's a really positive outcome.
Absolutely. I mean, seeing statistics like this in support of our sort of major technology opportunities really sort of reiterates the fact we've got the backing there. And you can link it back to the climate change statistics, the net zero, but I think the energy security side that Aled is touching on, the cost, I think most people are aware that when Russia invaded Ukraine, we saw enormous spikes to our electricity costs linked purely to the gas prices. This gives us protection from that security of supply and sort of confidence that we own our own infrastructure to be able to produce our own energy, I think is fundamental, and it's reassuring to see that coming through.
But maybe, because a lot of communities don't want to see more renewable energy, maybe the industry needs to do a better job at explaining those costs. And actually, people might want to actually start seeing it in their energy bills, because they can't see the benefit yet, can they?
They can't. There's a challenge we have. So we're actually in the process at the moment of looking at the reform of electricity market arrangements. This is handled by my UK colleagues rather than sort of us specifically representing Wales. But there's a real opportunity to look at how we price our electricity going forward. At the moment, it is linked to the gas price. And we need to disconnect that. There was a lot of discussion around sort of zonal pricing, and fortunately I think as a sector we're quite relieved we have moved away from that, but there is still further work to do to try and create that disconnect so that our consumers, the customers to this electricity, see that benefit in their bills.
And when you download the report and the stats that's behind it, you'll see that we haven't obviously put graphs up for everything because there's so much statistics in there. But we also asked people about where they lived. So did people in Mid Wales have a different view to onshore wind than people in South Wales? And we didn't find a huge statistical significance. There was a slight difference. We asked people in urban areas as opposed to rural areas whether they would prefer solar in their local area. There wasn't enough of a difference to put a graph on effectively. But you can have a look at the data. There was a slight difference with social grade. But even then, those in the social grade CTDE were hugely supportive of more renewables. So there's a lot more information in the stats when you see it, but that's true of responses to solar wind, onshore wind, nuclear. It wasn't really that different, depending on where you lived in Wales, which I thought was interesting as a story in itself. It just didn't make a very good graph. So let's have a look at what else we asked. So again, looking in more detail at voter intention, just huge levels of support amongst Labour and Plaid voters for solar generation, which we thought was really quite stark, and very high support for onshore wind. And I would say I was a bit surprised that half of all Reform voters very happy to have more renewable energy. And I think we've seen another poll this week that says that about the same number of Reform voters would be happy to have their pension invested in renewable energy as well. So I think it's quite, when you ask, I think I would ask the question, which party is furthest away from its supporters is a good question. And I think there's definitely an argument that Reform are slightly overstating in terms of their antagonism towards any form of renewable energy. But I do think perhaps in the Welsh context, Plaid Cymru, having just come back from their conference, do have somewhat of a disconnect. I think Labour, for example, I think the industry might say, haven't been as supportive in terms of getting things built in the last 5 years. The signalling has changed a little bit in the last year. So, all parties have got perhaps to look at the wider debate, what people are really thinking, whereas the noise is pointing them in one direction, or it's pointing them in two directions. Effectively, they're pulling them apart in a polarised way. And effectively, we have a bit that horseshoe theory of politics, where people at either end of the debate are actually closer to each other than they are to the middle. Somebody described it as a degrowth horseshoe, which I thought was quite interesting. Now, let's have a quick look at some of the other stats. So this is a nice little graph which reflects the previous stats. And you can see here, Labour, Plaid and Reform. Again, I do apologise to my Conservative friends. So this shows you, and you can spend a bit of time afterwards having a look at it, there's a bit of a difference there between the turquoise, the blue and the green. Huge support for solar and onshore, less for nuclear. And I think we need to ask a few more questions again about things like battery, because I don't think people have experienced enough about what batteries, large-scale batteries look or feel like, or look like, So perhaps we'll come back to that. So, moving on to grid infrastructure, because that is another real issue. As a member of the CBI Council for Wales, we have a lot of companies that would like to invest in Wales but can't plug their factories in. And of course, we need a huge amount of new energy for the arc furnace in Port Talbot. So we know that pylons are a touch point in terms of the debate. So we did ask about pylons, and you're not surprised when you just ask, do you like pylons? People will say, not really, thanks very much. So we had only 23% of respondents supported having new pylons in their local area. So we asked an extra question, and I think the way that YouGov did this is they broke the group into three, and they asked 3 different questions to 3 different groups of people. So that's how they work this out. So people were asked about whether they thought that undergrounding of cables should be mandated effectively. So no pylons, let's do an undergrounding. So when you're asked, should we underground rather than have pylons, people say, oh yeah, let's do that. So 56% will say, yeah, no, that's great, let's just put it underground. But when you say, oh, by the way, it's going to cost you a lot more money because it's more expensive to do, so it'll end up on your bill. So they say, oh no, no thanks. So quite a few people sort of said, no, I'm all right, thanks. So it went down from 56% down to 36%. And then when you said, oh, by the way, there might be quite an environmental cost because you have to dig up large trenches and take out some habitats and hedges and things. And they said, no, we don't want to do that, thanks very much. So that went down to 28%. So you can have a look at the data in more detail, but there's clearly a bit of an education job to be done here. We need a more informed debate about what's going to happen and the impact on our bills and on the environment. And there's another difficult question for you, because you're going to be part of trying to deliver what will effectively be quite significant new energy transmission across Wales, both underground, in the sea, overland, everywhere. What do you think?
So Nisha's role in this across GB is we're looking at the demand for energy and electricity in particular just going up and away from us. So my director, my boss says 2030 is Everest base camp, 2050 is the peak of Everest. So there's a very much focus on 2030. We need to be understanding what is coming from there. And then when you look at in order to keep bills low, where's the optimized place to put energy? And that's not necessarily the same place where demand is. And then you have to move energy around in order to get it to people. So we're not going to mandate, as I said, we don't develop policy, so we'll follow the policy of government, be that in Westminster or here in Cardiff Bay about that. But I think this is kind of familiar, I suppose. There's a bit of research, it's a little bit old now, which talked to people. They did a longitudinal study when they looked at what was the impact of pylons, what's the impact of underground, and then they went back 10 years later and said, now that it's been built, what was the impact? And the main thing that came out was the construction impacts. So when you're building underground cables, that the impacts of that time it took in order to build, let alone the other things around kind of the environment as well. And anecdotally, very anecdotally, when I've been stood in village halls, when people have experienced these things as well, that's a key thing they say, which is it took X number of months to put this, to build this thing, be it pylons or be underground, but underground takes much longer. How can you avoid these construction impacts in this local area? So it is not a straightforward thing. I guess I come from the Swansea Valley, and if you went down the Swansea Valley, there is energy infrastructure all over the place. But did I realise that as a child? I certainly don't. I do now because I start spotting the pylons. But I guess the point being is we need much more energy in the country to satisfy our demand. We are over the next 25 years, we'll be developing plans to do that. And this debate about the right way to move it around is going to be a key one for us as a society, because of financial costs, environmental costs, the cost on us in other ways is an important one for us to discuss.
Richard, there might be pristine parts of our national parks that we absolutely do not want to put pylons in. But could you tell us a little bit about the technical issues around undergrounding in certain parts of Wales that might have a more damaging effect?
Well, I mean, all of these things are intertwined, right, in terms of actually getting a project delivered and away. Access to grid is obviously a key part of developing a project. We've looked with other developers at the difference between overground and underground. It's about 5 times more expensive to go underground. So and fairly consistently across the developers, we would favour a targeted undergrounding policy where you deal with the bulk of the transmission on pylons, and then where you particularly want to protect an area, you go underground. And there's as you alluded to, there's a lot of work to underground a cable. You open trenches, and it's much harder to then maintain and monitor that circuit from that point on. So there's always pros and cons with these things. It does add cost to a project delivery, and we haven't seen any projects built in Wales in the last 5 years. We built the last big one at Clogainog. And that's a range of things which build up. So the cost of transmission is one of the aspects. In Wales, it's been protection of peat beds. It's a very hard line taken by Labour until more recently, where they're looking a bit more holistically, planning constraints, etc. The elements all stack up. But if you take sort of the way all these things interact, it's clear that if we want to build, the main driver for building major transmission links across Wales, and there's a real need for a north-south link to be built at the moment. The main driver for putting that link on ground, where businesses, industry can access it, is the continued build of renewable power, particularly in mid-Wales. And certain parties are taking positions against that renewable capability that then, without realising, wipes out the need to build the grid, wipes out the capabilities for businesses to then connect to that grid, and frankly all of us in the future connecting our heat pumps and our EVs and so on, as the demand ramps up, as Ella talked about. So I think there's a huge piece of work to educate the public, actually, and the parties to a large degree, on the way these things all interact with each other, that really creates an anti-growth environment if you're not very careful. And there's an enormous amount of misinformation in the press. We talked about renewables being expensive, right? And a large part of the press and the parties trying to take out renewable build in the UK will stick with gas that delivers cheap, reliable power. And we've completely proven that's not the case when there's a geopolitical event. So energy security is important. Renewables are the cheapest thing to deploy at the moment. How do you get that message through? People, if you explain it to them, they understand and they'll take choices, but they're being told the wrong information. So how we sort that out, particularly before a Welsh election next April, I think is too big a task.
Okay.
You kind of have to get to a point where there's a middle ground that allows you the time to really educate people the truth.
For me, I think there's an element of people on the polarised ends of each spectrum, and that's each spectrum, are saying, you know, we've had enough of experts. Either we've had enough, we're not listening to experts about climate change, or we're not listening to experts about the technological needs. But is that the experts' responsibility to fix that? You know, in the sense that perhaps we're not doing a good enough job to explain this to the public, so that the debate is being taken up by those polarised voices, those that shout the loudest. Jess?
I think we've all got a responsibility as individuals, personally. You know, I think there's a massive disconnect when you switch on a switch in your house and your lights come on, and there's very little appreciation of how that has happened. And I think with 45% of the Welsh population in fuel poverty at the moment, there's a large proportion of those individuals that are living potentially with gas for their hobs, with oil-fired radiators. That you know, the whole decarbonisation story and shift away from that potentially leaves them quite isolated. And I think, you know, you say a sort of disbelief in experts. Some would say that we're experts in renewables, so we're going to be biased. I think this narrative has to come across the board. You know, we need government to be telling an honest story. We need candidates, political candidates, to be telling an honest story, and we're not seeing that necessarily. It was really interesting. You touched on the Plaid Cymru conference at the weekend. Will Hayward actually did an interview with Rhin ap Iorwerth, and within that, there's a number of inaccuracies in what he's stating, and that's concerning because, you know, there's a sort of very vested position that individuals are going to have. You're a politician that wants to get into power, you will have a vested position. We, you know, as a sector, we have a vested position, but we've got to be pragmatic about this. We've got to find the middle ground and work out the communication tactics that work to level that playing field and make sure that what we're stating is accurate. You know, undergrounding is more expensive. It's not technically feasible in every solution. I mean, Rhin in his statement actually mentioned wooden poles for infrastructure at 132 kV. That's not feasible. You know, there are technical parameters that dictate what you can and can't do with electricity. There's safety factors to take into consideration. So there's a whole narrative that goes with this, and I think each and every one of us has a responsibility, even sort of the consumer to some extent, to think about where that power is coming from and how they're getting it.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because, you know, we're talking about Rhin and the Plaid Cymru view this week, but actually that's pretty similar to the political parties at the other end of the spectrum as well. So effectively, if you look at the polling and you look at the proportion of Senedd members that will make up the next Senedd based on the last polling, then you have got quite a significant majority of Senedd members who are very concerned or perhaps don't necessarily agree around the nature of the technological issues that we have in front of us. It isn't just Plaid Cymru, it's on both ends of that spectrum, isn't it? We've just got one more slide here actually, because we've looked at whether there was a difference in support for pylons or undergrounding depending on your voter intention, and there is a bit of a difference here. What you can see here is that reform voters were more opposed effectively to pylons. So, you know, you have a third of voters on the sort of left-leaning parties opposed, you've got a half in terms of the right-leaning parties. So it's interesting to see whether the leaders of each of those parties are reflecting what their supporters are actually thinking. I think perhaps for me that's the most interesting story that we're seeing from the results here. Aled, how is that going to affect how your organisation is going to be communicating? Because you will have to be talking to communities all over Wales about the impacts on them.
Yeah, so we do the central plans that other people take forward. We very much take our lead from society. So we very much take our lead from democracies, from our governments and the rest of it. And I think there is, even at worldwide level, at UK level, at kind of GB level, we heard differences there. So there's, especially when you talk about network, when you talk about grid, there's a very clear policy from kind of UK Gov for that, for example, but then you see differences when you get down to local areas. And certainly we've seen that there is a difference of view when you talk about the principle of things versus that principle coming closer and closer to a person and how it affects a person as well. So what we do in NISO is very much listen to what the policy direction is. And what we listen to is what we are going to get in policy terms from the government and governments as well. And we will respond to that. But yes, I'm sure your statistics are going to help people in the way they develop those policies and what they will come forward with. Okay,
so let's fast forward to May. We've got a new government. There are only two possibilities here: a right-leaning coalition or minority government, or a left-leaning one. And it's getting a bit close, one would argue, in terms of the polls. So either one of those governments, what is their biggest issue in the first year in terms of the energy industry, in terms of what we can deliver for the people of Wales, in terms of community energy, in terms of large-scale renewables? Aled.
Thanks for that one. I think one of the key things, which is understood, which is the amount of time this takes as well. So when we are developing, even the fastest thing we'd be talking about would be a solar development, which would be a 1 or 2 years time, and then much further out, for offshore wind or floating offshore wind or onshore wind. And the developing a network takes over a decade. It takes very long. So there's going to be a difficulty for a new government coming in, whatever it is, for them to put their stamp on what it is. I guess my ask from a kind of an independent organisation we are is a clear direction. What is you trying to achieve with your energy policy? Because it's not just about it's not just about the electrons, it's not just about the gigawatts. It is also about what that means for society. So be clear with what do you want this to mean for society, and that is around what type of energy we use, the grid we need. So for example, when we have the South Wales Industrial Cluster, that cluster needs a good grid to deliver the green projects that will deliver jobs, that will deliver a good community, etc., etc. Is that what our government wants? For them to be really clear about that and for us to be able to respond to that in our plans.
Richard, I'll ask you the same question. What would you like to see in the manifestos? What would you like to see in the first year of a new government?
For our projects, they're multi-year projects. RWE's invested about 3 billion in Wales over the last decade or so, and we would look to do the same again, given stable policy. Now that's across the entire spectrum of the energy transition, whether it's batteries or hydrogen or carbon capture. The thing we need most is long-term stable policy, and our projects are carbon capture will take 5 years to build. It's effectively an entire government term just to build. The payback on our projects is 15 to 20 years typically, whether it's a wind farm or whether it's more traditional infrastructure. So we need to have that long-term view. And these parties are taking very different stances on this. But I think what will resonate with the public is the jobs, the growth and the jobs and the long-term opportunity to live and work in Wales for their kids. And it doesn't matter really what your views on climate change, net zero are, and they're increasingly separating on that. If you focus in on growth and jobs, most people should get that. Mm-hmm. At the moment in South Wales particularly, if you want to build a factory to make something and employ a load of people, you're looking at least 10 years to get a grid connection. Now that just means that money's going somewhere else. It's going into the rest of the UK or into Europe. And we see that across both generation and demand projects at the moment. There's a massive need to build transmission infrastructure for an inevitably more electric future, no matter on your view on climate change. So what we need from the parties right now, I don't think it's time to fix all this, but they need to start shifting the narrative to growth and jobs. and they need to make sure that their manifestos for the next election don't lock them into a position that is fundamentally anti-growth and can be meshed potentially in a coalition with other parties in a productive way. You would hope that all of the parties would see investment in Wales and jobs in Wales as a positive, but that's not going to be the result of their current positions.
Jess, I think you've commissioned recently some report which looks at various party policies currently and what that might mean if they're responsible for government decision making from May onwards. What's your reflection on this?
We have indeed. It's quite fascinating. Some of the policy positions that are being adopted would potentially turn investment away, and that's a real risk. If this sector walks away from Wales, we end up with a considerable gap. You know, we lose out on the economic growth opportunity, we lose out on the jobs that Richard is alluding to, we miss all of those decarbonisation goals that we're talking about. So I think the next year needs to be about stability, it needs to be about pragmatism. We don't, you know, those polarised views, they don't really have a place in a stable policy position, and finding a middle ground. And to be fair, just to reflect on both the sort of right end and the left end of the engagement that we've been having, the minute we start talking about the economic growth opportunity, the jobs that this represents. So we had a report commissioned in May of this year. The opportunity from renewables in Wales is £47 billion of investment. That's not an insignificant figure. 10 million of that could come to Welsh businesses with the right levers in place. These are substantial numbers. The GVA is equivalent to 60% of the Welsh economy year on year. That's phenomenal. This could be a foundational sector for Wales, and there is a risk that if they choose wrong and they lock themselves into very, very strict positions in their manifestos, that they shut the door on that.
Clearly we need a bit of a balance here, don't we? We aren't going to be able to deliver the energy we need without large-scale renewables, but we do want to see more community-based developments. And, you know, we are really all quite excited by government-backed investments, like, for example, Trydan Gwyrdd, and perhaps the Welsh Government taking more equity on behalf of the people of Wales in terms of the energy that we're delivering. But that does require, it does require that balance. It's not one or the other, isn't it, Richard?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a place for both, isn't there? If a community is prepared to put a local turbine up and try and create a local benefit to that, then great. What it doesn't do is it doesn't address the bigger high voltage, hundreds of megawatts power demand for building industry and bringing large scale jobs. You need both. You need adequate transmission and a way for people to connect. Community benefits are interesting. Parties in Wales, not, you know, more or less all parties in Wales have talked about bringing a bigger slice of the pie, if you like, to Wales. Be very careful with that when you're looking at UK competitions for deployment of capital in competitive auctions. You need to be very careful about anything that increases the amount of or mandates public ownership, mandates community benefits. By all means, it's possible if you do it holistically across the UK. That should be the argument, really. But let's find a way to do that more holistically. Developers are quite happy to share ownership. They're quite happy to have community benefits. We do tens of millions of pounds of community benefits associated with our on and offshore wind projects already. There's an opportunity to do that through into the really big stuff we're talking about, which is carbon capture and hydrogen in the future. And we're happy to talk about all those things, but they're multi-billion pound projects, very hard to have a significant proportion of public ownership. And if you set a different bar in Wales, you'll simply see all the investment go elsewhere. And we've seen that for the last 5-10 years.
I'm afraid we don't have enough time to carry on now, but we'll just carry on over coffee. I'd just like to say, diolch yn fawr iawn, thank you ever so much for coming, because this is where the debate is going to be. Don't forget, this is one of those issues that, you know, politics has gone a bit mad in Wales in the last year. It's becoming very unpredictable, and this is part of the debate. So thank you ever so much for coming. Diolch yn fawr am ddod. Mae'r dadl wedi bod yn hynod diddorol. You can visit our website to download the report. You'll be able to see, I think, on the YouGov website, actually, all the available data as well. Obviously, thank you very much for coming to an event as Cavendish Cymru. We're really pleased about how we're helping organisations of all types engage more closely and have that conversation, because clearly there is a lot more talking to be done. So do get in touch with us if you need any more information. Diolch yn fawr iawn am ddod. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you very much. Thank you very much to our panel. I know they're very, very busy, but hopefully this is going to be helpful for industry, for communities and for government to be able to have a more informed discussion going forward. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Diolch.